So welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to learn how do we write some simple data to our backend to Firebase. Before I get started with writing them in Android Studio, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my backend in Firebase console and enable real-time database. So let's head there. I'm going to go to my real-time backend in here in Firebase. I'm going to go to the node that is called database. In my database, I have to make a few quick changes, and then also I have to explain how do we actually write the stuff. There are two types of databases in Firebase. One of them is called a Cloud Firestore, and the other one is called a real-time database. And for the purpose of this application, I want to use the real-time database, which is basically a way for us to write the stuff using nodes and dictionaries and hash maps. So I'm going to say create a database. And then when you begin creating the database, it asks you whether you want to start in the locked mode or whether you want to start in the test mode. And I want to begin it in the test mode simply because we want to be able to write the stuff without much care about whether the user is authenticated or not, whether the user has access to a certain node or not. These are topics that we'll discuss them in more details in future sections. But for now, we begin them in the test mode. If you're wondering where this test mode actually is and where does it actually exist, it's actually somewhere here in your rules. So if your data is in the mode that is test mode, it gives you a little warning here saying everything is now public. If you want to change that, you can just go to the rules, and in the rules you can actually set both of these to be false and false, which basically the moment you publish it, it means that the data is basically locked. Nobody can actually write to it. Or if you want, you can actually go to your rules and switch it to a very particular authentication, which is basically only for users who are authenticated. So I'm going to go ahead and say here, auth is not null, which means only users who are authenticated on this application or on this project, they get to do things in here. You can keep it either or, whether you can keep it true, which is public for everyone, or you can make it authentication null, which basically means everyone who is authenticated can write stuff to your backend in here. So that's what we need to do in this case. And then I have my backend ready now, and I want to explain to you what this node actually is. This is the node where all of our real-time database basically exists in. For instance, if I could go ahead in here and manually something, I could say let's have a value by the name or by the key of say name, and then I'm going to put my name in here, and then I'm going to go ahead and say I have another value in here. Let's say that one is going to be email, and then that's going to be email, for instance. Now that is basically how our database gets written in here. I am, however, not going to do that. I'm going to go ahead and write some data using our Firebase application in Android Studio. And then in future lessons, I'm going to come back in here and explain how we actually structure our data. So let's go ahead and delete that. And I'm going to delete that one as well. So the only thing we need to know is that when we write stuff, it actually writes it here to this node in our real-time database. So let's head back to our Android Studio and see how we're going to actually do that. I'm going to go to my file called write simple, and here is where we want to write a simple data to our main real-time database in our console. So since we want to be able to write to our main node, or what we call basically a root node, we need to be able to get access to that root node. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the main activity, and in here in the companion object, I'm going to say I have a value, let's call it database, usually we call it database or database reference. I'm going to say that is going to be firebase.database. And that's basically getting access to the root node of my real-time database to my Firebase. So we now have access to that root node, and we can actually use that root node to write data in whichever way that we need it. So I'm going to go to my write simple. In the write simple, I'm going to say main activity dot database. I'm going to go ahead and say in the database, I want to get access to a certain node. So let's see what nodes we have in here. Currently, we are in here in the main node. Let's say we had a node called data. So that is the node that I want to get access to. I'm going to go ahead and say here dot get reference, and in the reference I'm going to say get data. So that's going to get the very first node, which is this guy. Then I'm going to go ahead and say get the child of that, and then anything that you add in here, a child or whatever, they don't have to really exist in there. If they are not there, Firebase is going to create them for you. So I'm going to say create a child for, let's say, tests, and in the child.tests I want to do this. I want to set the value to something, and I want to set the value with a task completion. So I'm going to say set the value to this. Go ahead and say this is from Android, and then once you did that, I'm going to go ahead and say database completion, if I'm not wrong, or database reference, if I'm not wrong, database reference dot completion listener. In the completion listener, I'm going to go ahead and say here is what happened. In the completion listener, we have our database error and the database reference. So I'm going to say, let's call them error and ref. And in the error and ref, here is what we need to do with what we got. If there was an error, if error was null, it means if nothing went wrong, basically, and else of it. So that is the else part of the whole thing. I feel like I might be missing something in here. Let me make sure that, okay, set value, I opened it in here. Let's close it down. So let's see what we got in this entire thing. So basically we said, go to the database root node, get the data node, add a child called tests if it doesn't exist, then write a value for it called this is from Android, and then get the completion listener of that. The completion listener tells us whether there is an error, or if there is no error, it gives you the reference to what they have just written. In this case, this reference will become the root node data tests. And then if there was no error, I want to say, show me the message that says wrote, say, successfully. And then if there was an error, say, I don't know, maybe database error. It doesn't matter. Of course, you can actually print the actual error in here, find the exact exception that happened in here, but I leave that to you guys. So let's run our application, and if it all works, we should be able to use our emulator to write something, and we should see it here in our backend. So I'm going to go ahead and say write simple data, and then the moment I hit the write simple data, it says data test, this is from Android. Let me try that again. So let's say write simple data, which is going to basically overwrite this value in here. Doesn't make any differences in here. Let me say there is a test value. I'm going to delete this test and rewrite that simple data to see that actually works the way we were hoping is going to work. So far we managed to write a very basic piece of data in here to a very specific location. However, we still haven't discussed how this thing actually works, or how does it know which structure it has to use for writing the content. We will see that in a few lessons when we talk about objects, and I'm going to explain to you how does this thing actually work in here. But for now, our goal was to write a piece of data. We did that successfully. In our next lesson, we're going to use the next button, which we're going to read this data and fetch it back to our Android application. Let's go to that.